Hey guys, let's get back to the topic of demand and the concepts in relation to demand curve. So hopefully you remember from the previous video that it's very important that you understand the difference between quantity demanded and demand. Right? So demand, when you use the word demand, you're just looking at the relationship between price and the quantity we want to buy. Quantity demanded is the specific number of units that we are buying. All right, so make sure you understand that. We drew a bunch of demand curves. We talked about the difference between inferior and normal goods, substitutes and complements. These are just some of the factors that change how much we are going to buy, right? So the law of demand is just looking at the relationship between price and quantity of the good. And then we talked about your income making you buy more or less of the goods depending on whether they're normal or inferior, and then whether you're looking at the price of substitutes or complements. So make sure you're very comfortable with analyzing how much of a particular good we buy when any of these changes before we proceed to today's topic. And again, if you're not comfortable, go look at the link on the top right of your video. So the next thing that we're going to build on to be able to understand the relationship between price and quantity with a lot more accuracy is, so far we've said, okay, if price goes up, I'll buy less. Now the next thing is how much less, right? Because that's also going to matter when you're making certain decisions. So let me put a scenario up for you, and then we will get back to analyzing this a lot more. But let's say you're running a local business, right? So you're a baker, you're running a local bakery, you're selling cakes amongst a lot of other things, and you're charging $20 per unit of cakes, and you're selling 100 units, right? So let's say that's what you're doing. Your costs are rising, your landlord says you have to pay more in rent, the ingredients are costing more, any number of reasons. So your costs are rising, so the natural thing for you to do is say, well, I need to increase the price that I charge to my customers. So now that you understand the law of demand, you know that you are going to sell fewer cakes. Right? So that's a given. That tells you that the relationship between price and the quantity that people are going to want to buy is negative. Now the next question is how much less? Because if you increase price and people buy a lot less of your cakes, then it's not good for you. But if they only reduced how much they buy by a small amount, then you might be okay. All right, so that's understanding this last part of the scenario is what we are going to focus on today, is how much do consumers change their behavior when price of a good changes. All right, so that's called elasticity. So let's look at the definition, and then we'll do some numerical examples. Elasticity, just by itself as a definition, measures how much of one variable changes when something else changes by a percent. So that's just a mathematical definition. When we apply it to the concept of demand, we are saying how much of quantity demanded changes when the price of a good changes by a price. So we're going to use the mathematical concept of elasticity and apply it to the theory of law of demand in what we are studying here. So it allows us to analyze demand curve with a lot more precision. It gives us a numerical way to see how quantity demanded is changing when the price is changing. Again, everything else is kept constant. So it measures how sensitive we are to a change in price. So how much more or how much less are people going to buy when the price of the good changes? All right, so that's what we're going to talk about a lot more today. So the price elasticity of demand, and we usually just use the Greek letter epsilon. So you'll see epsilon a few times to represent what elasticity is. It measures how much quantity of a good is going to change when there is a change in the price of that good. All right, so we'll look at the definition, and then we'll do an example as well. So when we talk about elasticity, it's always in percentages. So we are representing this number in percentages, and you'll see when I talk about with the equation. And when I'm going over the equation, think about what unit elasticity might have. All right, so like distances are in kilometers or miles. Think about the unit you have here when we are defining elasticity. So when the price of a good changes by a percent, how much does quantity demanded change by? You should know that this relationship is going to be negative. Right? If price goes up, QD goes down. If price goes down, QD goes up. But now we're looking at how much it changes by. All right, so that's what I just said. And we never want to be violating the law of demand, which says that there's a negative relationship between price of a good and the amount of quantity that we are going to be willing and able to buy. Price elasticity of demand is the percent change in quantity demanded, and I'll explain what percent change means in a second as well, divided by the percent change in price. So when you look at this number, it'll be, if this is 5, then it says that when the price of a good goes up by a percent, quantity goes down by 5%. So that's the epsilon I was talking about. That's the notation I'm going to use. It's the percent change in QD divided by the percent change in price. Now when we talk about percent change, this is how you measure a percent change in something. So we have two percent changes that we are going to be calculating, we look at the new value minus the old value divided by the old value times 100. And that will give you a percent change in quantity demanded. All right, so let's do an example. So let's say if the price of a burger that you're buying goes from 2 to 2.20, right? So the price is going up by 20 cents. The amount of burgers you buy falls by 2. It goes from 10 to 8. So we have to calculate the elasticity of demand. We have to first calculate the percent change in QD and pause and try to do it on your own and then get back to make sure you did it correctly. And then you divide that by the percent change in price. All right, so let's look at the equation here. So your quantity goes from 10 to 8. So you're changing your quantity by 2 divided by the original quantity, which is 10 times 100, divided by the percent change in price, which is $2.20 to $2. So you're changing by 20 cents, divided by the original price. So the original price and the original quantity is what you keep in the denominator of both equations times 100, and then the final answer you get is 2. So you should ask yourself, why is this a positive number and not negative? And you're right, when I did this, I just dropped the negative sign, right? So I've said this to you before, this number, when you're doing it for the first few times, make sure you don't leave the negative out. But as you do this, everyone knows it's negative, so sometimes economists just drop the negative sign because they know that the relationship between P and QD is always negative. So make sure you understand how to use the formula. It's the top part is change in QD divided by the original quantity times 100, and the denominator is change in price divided by the original price times 100. And then once you cancel all the variables out, you will notice that the number 2 is unit free. The percentages just cancel out. All right, so make sure you understand how to use the formula. So what does it mean, right? So what does it mean for price elasticity of demand to be -2? You probably should be able to guess this. It means that if the price of a good goes up by 1%, the quantity that we buy goes down by 2%. Or if the price of the good goes down by 1%, the quantity that we buy goes up by 2%. So it goes both ways, right? So it tells us how much do we react when the price of a good is changing. And again, don't forget that the law of demand always says there's a negative relationship between these two variables. All right, so in the next video we will talk about how do we graph all of this, but let me just differentiate the different kinds of elasticities, and then we'll continue with graphing them and concluding this particular topic in the next video. So a demand curve which is elastic, what that means is we are very responsive to when price changes. All right, so that's what I said, it's very sensitive. When price changes by 1%, the amount we buy changes by a lot. That's why it's called elastic demand curve. So think about the word elastic, it means there's a lot of room. So that's a good way to remember that if the price changes, you're going to adjust your behavior a whole lot. All right, so price elasticity of demand in numerical formula, the number should be less than -1. All right, so if you ever calculate elasticity, price elasticity of demand, and your number is less than -1, -5, -6, then you know that that particular demand curve is elastic. The other one is inelastic, which means you're not very responsive. So the price of a good changes, you do not adjust your behavior a whole lot. So now when you calculate this number numerically, this is always going to be a fraction. It's going to be between 0 and -1. It's not going to be 0. That's a special case which we will talk about later. But that's what inelastic demand curve means. And I think when I graph all of this in the next video, it will make a lot more sense. But just understand, elastic means a lot of room, so you're going to adjust your behavior a lot. Inelastic means there isn't a lot of room, and so you're not going to adjust your behavior a lot. And then you have special cases, which is perfectly elastic, which means you're going to adjust your behavior to an infinite amount. There might also be a case where you don't adjust your behavior at all. That's perfectly inelastic. And then unit elastic is where you adjust your behavior by the same proportion as how much the price is going up by. And again, this is just defining. When we look at the graphs, it will make more sense. Here are some examples. So all of these are negative. Pause and think about what they mean, and then come back and then I'll explain it. So price elasticity of demand of restaurant meals having the number of 2.3, what that means is if the price of restaurant meals goes up by 1%, the amount that we buy in restaurants goes down by almost 2.5%. So we adjust our behavior a whole lot when price of restaurant meals goes up, and that makes sense because we'll eat at home, right? So there are reasons why that happens. Eggs and healthcare, on the other hand, are very inelastic. So if the price of healthcare, if the price your doctor charges goes up by 1%, you will adjust your behavior by a very, very small amount. And that again makes sense because if I'm sick and I need to visit the doctor, if they're charging a higher price, most likely I'm still going to go. So in the next video, the other thing we're going to talk about is what are some of the factors that determine whether we are going to have an elastic or inelastic demand curve. So think about those as well before we start the next video. So just to conclude and set up the next video, we talked about what it means when we say price changes, how much does quantity change by? That's elasticity. And in the next video, we will look at it graphically and then analyze this topic a little bit more and conclude the topic of elasticity. So make sure you review this content, and I will see you in the next video.